Imagine you are a soldier, you have survived the battle, the fighting is over, you are a prisoner of war, but you are alive. In the medieval world, that is almost mercy. You wait. Days pass. You hear the clink of chains, the bark of orders, the shuffle of thousands of feet around you. According to later Byzantine accounts, as many as 15,000 men, your brothers in arms, all captured, all waiting. Then the Byzantine soldiers come for you, not to execute you, not to ransom you. They come with instruments, and they come with a purpose so methodical, so deliberate, so cold, that it will not just end your life as you know it. It will end an entire empire, one by one, 100 at a time. 99 men are blinded, completely, utterly, both eyes gone. The 100th man, one eye taken, one left. He will be your guide. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers, blinded, formed into columns, and then sent home, not to die in the field, not buried in a foreign grave, sent home. Because the emperor didn't just want to defeat his enemy, he wanted his enemy to see what defeat truly looked like. Weeks later, when those columns finally reached him, Tsar Samuel reportedly collapsed at the sight. According to Byzantine accounts, as many as 15,000 of his own men stumbling and weeping in endless broken columns across the hills. 2 days after that, on October 6, 1014, he was dead. One battle, one order, one parade of darkness. One battle did not end the war overnight, but it broke Bulgaria's ability to survive it. This is the Battle of Kleidion, 1014 AD. This is the story of Basil II, the man history would call the Bulgar Slayer. And this is the brutal truth of what it costs to build an empire that lasts 1,000 years. Before we go any further, if you are new here, welcome to Wars in History, the channel that doesn't sanitize the past. We go where the history books hesitate. Hit that subscribe button right now and tap the like if you want more stories like this one. It genuinely helps this channel reach more history lovers just like you. Now, let's go back to the year 976 AD. Because before Basil could carry out the mass blinding remembered by later Byzantine accounts, he first had to survive nearly 40 years of war trying to reach that moment. The year is 976 AD. The Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome, the most powerful Christian state on earth, is in crisis. Its emperor, Basil II, has just inherited the purple robe of Constantinople at the age of approximately 18. He is young, untested, and immediately surrounded by enemies. Powerful military generals, men called the Dynatoi, the powerful ones, treat the throne as a prize to be seized. Revolts erupt almost immediately. For more than a decade, Basil will fight not foreign enemies, but the predators within his own palace walls. But on his northern frontier, something else is stirring, something that will consume the next half-century of his reign and define his legacy forever. The First Bulgarian Empire, fierce, expansionist, and fiercely proud, is rising under a new and extraordinary leader. His name is Samuel, and Samuel has a long memory and longer ambitions. The Bulgarians had clashed with the Byzantines for generations, but what begins under Samuel is different. This is not a border skirmish, this is not a seasonal raid, this is no ordinary conflict. It became a brutal, decades-long struggle for control of the entire Balkan peninsula, fought in mountain passes and burning villages, in frozen valleys and scorched fields. Each man wants to dominate the other utterly. Each man believes with absolute conviction that only one empire can endure. Basil II would grow from that besieged young emperor into something the medieval world had rarely seen. A soldier king of iron will and pitiless calculation. He slept in the field with his troops. He gave up the luxuries of Constantinople. He was, by every account, relentless. Contemporary descriptions present him as short but well-proportioned, with brilliant light blue eyes, plain dress, abrupt speech, and the habits of a soldier rather than a courtly emperor. He had no wife, no children. His empire was his life, and its enemies were his only obsession. Samuel was his equal in stubbornness, if not in resources. A brilliant commander, he had carved a Bulgarian empire that stretched at its height from the Adriatic Sea to the Black Sea. He fortified mountain passes, launched devastating raids deep into Byzantine territory, and once, in a moment that would scar Basil II permanently, annihilated an entire Byzantine army at the gates of Trajan in 986 AD. The young emperor barely escaped with his life on horseback. It was the deepest humiliation of his reign, and he never, ever forgot it. What followed was not merely a war, it was a grudge match fought across generations, two men, two empires, two absolute wills colliding in the mountains and valleys of what is now Bulgaria, Greece, and North Macedonia. Villages burned, crops were destroyed, populations were displaced. Year after year, Basil II launched campaigns of attrition, not seeking the grand, decisive battle, but slowly, patiently, bleeding Bulgaria dry. By the year 1014, Samuel was aging and exhausted. His empire was shrinking. His armies had been worn down by decades of Byzantine pressure. And Basil II, older now, harder, colder, was finally ready to deliver the killing blow. He marched north that summer with one objective, not just to win, to end it. What happened next, in a fortified mountain pass called Kleidion, would go down as one of the most tactically brilliant and morally terrifying moments in all of medieval warfare. The war between the Byzantine Empire and the First Bulgarian Empire did not begin with Basil II. It did not begin with Samuel. It was not born in a single moment of ambition or grievance. It was ancient. It was structural. It was, in many ways, inevitable. Because two empires sharing a mountain range can only negotiate for so long before someone reaches for a sword. The Bulgars had first settled the lands between the Danube River and the Balkan Mountains in the 7th century AD, carving out a realm that sat directly on Byzantium's northern doorstep. From the very beginning, the relationship was explosive. The two powers clashed repeatedly across the 8th century, and though the Byzantines won important victories, they could never fully dislodge the Bulgars from their homeland, nor bring them permanently under Constantinople's political control. The Bulgars were simply too entrenched, too resilient, and too willing to fight. Then came the year 811, and the catastrophe that Byzantium would never forget. The Emperor Nikephoros I launched the largest Byzantine military expedition in centuries, marching a massive army deep into Bulgarian territory, sacking the Bulgarian capital, and confident, perhaps overconfident, in the power of imperial Rome. The Bulgar Khan Krum allowed the Byzantines to march in. He watched them celebrate, and then he sealed the mountain passes behind them. Trapped in a narrow defile on the morning of July 26, 811, the Byzantine army was ambushed, surrounded, and annihilated. Emperor Nikephoros I became the first Roman emperor to die in battle against a foreign enemy in over 4 centuries. According to historical tradition, Khan Krum had the emperor's skull lined with silver and used it as a drinking cup. It was a humiliation so profound, so deliberate, that Byzantium would carry the memory of it into every subsequent conflict with Bulgaria, a wound beneath the surface of every negotiation and every campaign. Peace came eventually, as it always does after catastrophe. The 9th century saw the two powers settle into an uneasy coexistence, punctuated by flares of violence, until the ascent of the Bulgar Khan Simeon in 893. Simeon was educated in Constantinople, spoke Greek, understood Byzantine culture better than almost any foreign ruler of his time, and used that knowledge to devastating effect. He spent the better part of his reign waging war against the empire, twice reaching the walls of Constantinople, and dreamed openly of becoming the emperor of a combined Byzantine-Bulgarian realm. At the Battle of Achelous in 917, his forces ambushed and crushed a divided Byzantine army in one of the worst imperial defeats of the 10th century. Simeon never achieved his dream of Constantinople's throne, but he left Bulgaria vastly expanded, powerful, and deeply convinced of its own destiny. His son, Peter I, held the Bulgarian throne for 4 decades, until the empire of the Bulgars was shattered from the east by the invasion of Sviatoslav of Kiev, which the Byzantines had quietly engineered. By 971, the Byzantine Emperor John I Tzimiskes had driven the Rus out and declared Bulgaria a conquered province. The Bulgarian Tsar Boris II was paraded through Constantinople in ritual humiliation. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed as though the Bulgarian question was finally settled. It was not. Out of the wreckage of that conquest, 4 brothers from the powerful Bulgarian aristocratic family known as the Kometopouli rose to fill the power vacuum. Their names were David, Moses, Aaron, and Samuel. They controlled the western Bulgarian territories that Tzimiskes had never fully subdued. The mountains and valleys of what is now North Macedonia, western Bulgaria, and parts of Albania. These lands had not been broken, and out of these lands a new Bulgarian resistance was born. David died early, killed by Vlach nomads in a skirmish. Moses was killed during a siege. Aaron would eventually be assassinated on Samuel's direct orders, accused of treachery with the Byzantines. That left Samuel, the last surviving and most capable of the 4 brothers. Samuel did not simply survive, he expanded. He launched devastating raids deep into Byzantine territory, striking Thessaly, reaching the Peloponnese in the south of Greece, sacking the ancient city of Larissa in 986, and carrying its population north as captives. He rebuilt a Bulgarian empire that at its height stretched from the Adriatic Sea, in the west to the Black Sea in the east, with his capital at Ohrid, deep in the mountains. By 997, he had declared himself Tsar, the supreme ruler of a resurrected Bulgarian empire. He was brilliant, energetic, and absolutely unwilling to accept Byzantine dominance. Into this storm walked Basil II. Basil had inherited the throne in 976 at the age of approximately 18, but inheriting the Byzantine throne in the late 10th century was less a gift than a death sentence postponed. The empire was dominated by powerful military aristocratic families, the Dynatoi, who treated the palace as a prize to be seized when the emperor was weak. Basil was immediately tested by the rebellion of the general Bardas Skleros, who launched a full-scale civil war. Basil survived that crisis only with the help of the equally dangerous general Bardas Phocas, and the fragile peace barely held before Phocas himself revolted in 987. For the first decade and a half of his reign, Basil was fighting not Bulgaria, but his own empire's most powerful men. Yet even as those internal fires burned, Samuel was raiding freely, and Basil, still young and militarily inexperienced, made his first move north in 986, leading a large army to besiege the city of Serdica, modern Sofia. The siege failed. The city held, and as Basil's frustrated army withdrew southward, Samuel's forces were waiting in the narrow mountain pass known as the Gates of Trajan. The ambush was devastating. The Byzantine army was torn apart in the defile. Soldiers died in their thousands. Basil himself barely escaped on horseback, fleeing the disaster with the remnants of his bodyguard. It was the most humiliating defeat of his reign, arguably the worst Byzantine military disaster since the death of Nikephoros I, and it burned itself permanently into the soul of a young emperor who had not yet become the Iron Man history would remember. That defeat changed Basil II. Scholars and chroniclers who describe him after the 986 disaster are describing a different man from the untested youth of 976. He hardened. He shed the trappings of the luxury-soaked Byzantine court. He stopped surrounding himself with powerful nobles and civilian advisors and began spending his campaigns in the field with his soldiers. He imposed strict military discipline, led by personal example, and developed a strategic patience that was almost inhuman. He was going to destroy the Bulgarian Empire, but he was going to do it correctly, methodically, without another catastrophe. He was going to bleed it dry before he delivered the final blow. Basil dealt with his internal enemies first, crushing Bardas Phokas definitively in 989, in part with the help of Varangian mercenaries sent by Vladimir of Kiev. With the Dynatoi broken and the empire consolidated, he turned his full attention north. Beginning in 1001, he launched a series of systematic campaigns into Bulgarian territory, not seeking one grand decisive battle, but pushing forward, capturing fortress after fortress, city after city. He pushed into the Bulgarian heartland, recovering cities and fortresses across the Balkans. Vodena, Veroia, Servia, and eventually Skopje fell to his forces one by one. He retook the ancient Via Egnatia, the great Trans-Balkan road, depriving Samuel of the ability to move armies quickly across his own territory. In 1005, the critical port of Dyrrhachium on the Adriatic changed hands without a battle, delivered to Basil by a Bulgarian nobleman who chose imperial gold over Samuel's loyalty. The strategic noose was tightening. Samuel fought back everywhere, constantly, brilliantly. He raided, he harassed, he fortified passes. He used the mountains, the mountains his family had controlled for generations, as a weapon. Every time Basil pushed forward, Samuel retreated into the high ground and waited. Every winter, Byzantine armies had to withdraw. Every spring, the war resumed. It was a cycle of sustained violence that consumed villages and farmland and human lives on both sides for more than a decade, and it showed no sign of ending. But by the year 1014, the two men had been at war, directly or indirectly, for nearly 4 decades. Samuel was aging. His empire was shrinking year by year, fortress by fortress. His armies were thinner than they had been. His population had been raided, taxed, and conscripted beyond endurance. He controlled the mountains, but the lowlands were slipping away. Basil II was in his mid-50s. He was still in the field, still relentless, still patient, and he had learned, in the most brutal way possible, in the blood-soaked defile of the gates of Trajan, that the mountains of Bulgaria could not be taken by raw force alone. They had to be outsmarted. In the summer of 1014, he marched north one more time. Samuel had prepared for him. Samuel thought he knew exactly how this campaign would unfold. He was wrong. By the summer of 1014, Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria had been fighting the Byzantine Empire for the better part of his adult life. He was not a young man anymore. He was not the energetic, raiding commander who had shattered Basil's army at the gates of Trajan back in 986. He was older, heavier with the weight of decades of war, and he ruled an empire that was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, not from any single catastrophic defeat, but from Basil's relentless annual campaigns that chipped away at Bulgarian territory year after year, fortress by fortress, harvest by harvest. Samuel had endured by turning the terrain itself into an ally. He denied Basil the open field confrontation that Byzantine heavy cavalry and disciplined infantry were designed to win. He survived, in short, by being smarter than his enemy expected. But survival was no longer enough. By 1014, Samuel faced a crisis that went beyond the battlefield. His own nobility, the boyars who owed him loyalty and military service, were growing restless. Years of Byzantine scorched earth campaigns had devastated the Bulgarian heartland. Crops were being burned before they could be harvested. Fortified towns that had stood for generations were falling to Byzantine siege engineers. The boyars who controlled the land were watching their estates stripped bare, their people taken as captives, their wealth evaporating. Samuel needed to show them that the Bulgarian Empire could still defend itself. He needed a victory, or at the very least, he needed to stop Basil's advance cold. He needed to prove that Bulgaria still had walls. So Samuel decided to build one. The Kleidion Pass, the name itself in Greek, means the key, was the critical northern gateway through the Belasica mountain range along the Struma River Valley. This pass was the natural and most practical route for any Byzantine army marching north from Thessalonica into the Bulgarian heartland. It was the road Basil would have to use. Samuel knew this. Every experienced commander in the Balkans knew this. The mountain terrain on both sides of the pass was steep, heavily forested, and practically impassable for large armies with supply trains and cavalry. Whoever controlled the pass controlled the route, and Samuel intended to control it absolutely. What Samuel's engineers and soldiers constructed across the Kleidion Pass was not merely a wall, it was a system of fortification, a massive wooden palisade reinforced with earthworks, stretching across the mouth of the pass and anchored at both ends against the steep mountain slopes. Byzantine sources refer to this type of defensive barrier as a daima, a deliberately constructed obstacle designed to channel, slow, and ultimately stop an advancing army. The daima at Kleidion was built to maximize the natural advantages of the terrain. The pass was narrow, the slopes were too steep for cavalry to operate. An army trying to force its way through would have no room to maneuver, no way to bring its numerical strength to bear, and no ability to flank the defenders. The wooden wall transformed the entire geography of that mountain corridor into a killing ground for any force that tried to push through it. And behind that wall, Samuel placed a staggering number of men. The exact size of the Bulgarian force defending the Kleidion fortifications is uncertain, but it was clearly large enough to make the position look formidable even to a veteran Byzantine army. These were not just garrison troops or militia levies thrown together at the last moment. This was the assembled military strength of the Bulgarian Empire, dug in behind prepared fortifications on ground of Samuel's choosing, commanded by generals who had spent their careers fighting in exactly these mountains. By any conventional military calculus, the position was close to impregnable. Samuel believed he had found his gates of Trajan. He believed he had found the spot where Basil's army would break. Basil II marched north from Thessalonica in July 1014. He commanded a large, well-supplied and veteran Byzantine army, the product of decades of his personal military reforms and annual campaign experience. His soldiers were among the best-equipped fighting men in the medieval world. His infantry were disciplined and hardy. His cataphract cavalry, armored riders on armored horses, were the most powerful mounted shock force in European warfare. His officers were experienced, loyal, and had been fighting alongside their emperor for years. This was not the young, overconfident army that had marched into the gates of Trajan in 986. This was the sharp, battle-hardened instrument of a man who had spent nearly 30 years preparing to end this war. The Byzantine army arrived at the mouth of the Kleidion Pass and found exactly what Samuel had prepared for them. The palisade stretched wall to wall across the narrow defile. Bulgarian troops manned it in depth. The slopes rising on both sides were choked with trees and too steep for any organized military operation of scale. Basil ordered his commanders to assess the defenses. The assessment was not encouraging. The wooden wall was solid, well garrisoned, and the terrain gave the defenders every possible advantage. Basil ordered a frontal assault anyway. This was not recklessness. It was doctrine and necessity. An army that refuses to press an enemy position reveals its own hesitation, and Basil needed to test the defenses, to probe for weakness, to measure the Bulgarian resistance, to understand what exactly he was facing. The Byzantine infantry advanced up the pass. The Bulgarians held the palisade and answered with arrows, spears, and the simple advantage of higher ground. The assault was repulsed. Byzantine soldiers came back down the pass, having gained nothing except casualties and a clearer understanding of how well prepared the enemy truly was. Basil ordered a second assault. It failed as the first had. The palisade held. The Bulgarians defended with disciplined confidence. They had built this wall knowing it would be tested, and it was holding precisely as Samuel had planned. Here, in lesser commanders, despair might have set in, or worse, the temptation to throw more men at the same problem in the hope that brute force would eventually crack the line. Byzantine military history contained examples of exactly that kind of catastrophic stubbornness. Basil did not fall into that trap. He pulled his forces back. He made camp. And he began to think. Samuel, watching from behind his fortified wall as the Byzantine assaults failed, reportedly received word that the situation was stable. The pass was holding. Basil's army was stalled. Samuel, by some accounts, left the immediate vicinity of Kleidion, possibly travelling to his secondary position near Strumitsa, a day or so south of the main fortifications, or perhaps to oversee other elements of his defensive network. He was confident. The wall had done its job. The Emperor of the Romans had thrown himself against the palisade of Bulgaria and been turned back, just as he had been turned back at the gates of Trajan, 28 years before. But Samuel had missed something critical, something that, had he considered it, might have changed the entire outcome of that summer. The Belasica mountains, rising to the east and southeast of the Kleidion Pass, were steep, heavily forested, and seemingly impassable for a military force. That word, seemingly, was doing an enormous amount of work, because there were men who knew those mountains who were not Bulgarian. There were local inhabitants, shepherds and other people who moved through those high passes as a matter of seasonal routine, who knew paths through the Belasica heights that no army had ever thought to use as a military route. These were not roads. They were barely trails, winding through dense forest up gradients that would exhaust even unencumbered men. They were not paths anyone would choose to move an army along, because no sensible military commander would ever look at those slopes and see anything other than an obstacle. Basil II looked at those slopes and saw an opportunity. While his main army remained encamped before the palisade, visible, present, threatening, keeping the Bulgarian garrison focused on the pass in front of them, Basil gave a set of orders to one of his most capable and aggressive generals, a man named Nikephoros Xiphias, who served as the strategos, the military governor, of Philippopolis. Nikephoros Xiphias had a reputation for initiative, physical courage, and the kind of aggressive decisiveness that Basil trusted in a subordinate who would be operating out of sight and out of communication once his mission began. The orders were straightforward in conception and horrifying in execution. Xiphias was to take a substantial column of troops, find the mountain paths through the Belasica heights with the help of local guides, climb over the mountain in secret, move through the forest above and behind the Bulgarian palisade, and attack from the rear, simultaneously with Basil launching another frontal assault on the wall from the valley floor. It was a plan of extraordinary tactical elegance, and it required extraordinary men to carry it out, because the mountain did not care about elegance. The mountain only cared about whether the soldiers climbing its slopes were strong enough, silent enough, and desperate enough to reach the other side. Before we follow Xiphias up that mountain, a quick word. You are watching a story about secrecy, strategy, and information being the difference between victory and total destruction. Basil won because Samuel did not know what was coming. In today's world, your personal information is just as exposed as Samuel's rear flank, your browsing, your location, your data, visible to anyone looking. NordVPN encrypts your connection and shields your online activity so that nobody can see your moves before you make them. Go to nordvpn.com and use the link in the description to get a huge discount on a 2-year plan. Now, back to the mountain. There is a moment in every military campaign where the situation forces a commander to make a choice between the comfortable and the possible. The comfortable choice is to keep battering the walls in front of you, to trust in numbers, in discipline, in the sheer accumulated force of a Byzantine imperial army. The possible choice is to look at an impossibility and ask the single question that separates great commanders from the rest. What if we go around? Basil II stood in front of Samuel's palisade and chose the possible. The man who gave the plan its operational form was Nikephoros Xiphias, the strategos, the military governor of Philippopolis. He was not yet a famous man. He was a competent, aggressive, and experienced field commander who had served under Basil II in previous Bulgarian campaigns, including a deep penetration raid in the early 1000s that had reached the old Bulgarian capitals of Pliska and Great Preslav. He knew the terrain of the Balkans. He knew how Bulgarian forces thought and moved. And when he looked at the Belasica mountain range rising steeply to the east and southeast of the Kleidion Pass, he did not see an obstacle. He saw a weapon. Xiphias approached Basil with a proposal. While the main Byzantine army continued its pressure against the palisade, keeping the Bulgarian garrison fully occupied, pinned in place, focused entirely on the threat in front of them, Xiphias would take a picked infantry detachment, find the mountain paths through the forested slopes of Belasica with the help of local guides, and cross over the top of the range in secret. He would come down on the other side, behind the Bulgarian fortifications, and, at a prearranged moment, launch a charge into the rear of Samuel's army simultaneously with a renewed frontal assault from Basil's main force. The plan was elegant. It was also genuinely dangerous. The Belasica slopes were steep and densely forested. The paths through them were not roads. They were barely tracks, known only to local inhabitants who had spent their lives moving livestock through those heights in all seasons. Moving a military formation through that terrain in summer heat, in silence, without losing men to exhaustion or falls, without alerting Bulgarian scouts or patrols, and arriving on the far side with enough cohesion and fighting strength to deliver a meaningful shock attack, all of that was not guaranteed. It was a gamble. But Basil had been denied the direct option. The wall in front of him was solid, and the terrain around it gave him no alternatives. He approved Xiphias's plan. There was, however, another piece to the strategic situation that made this particular moment even more complex. Before the main confrontation at Kleidion, Samuel had attempted a diversionary move of his own. He had sent a Bulgarian commander named Nestoritsa south with a substantial force to threaten the Byzantine city of Thessaloniki. The intention was clear: force Basil to divide his army, or better yet, compel him to abandon the Kleidion campaign entirely and rush south to defend one of the empire's most important Macedonian cities. It was a smart move. Thessaloniki was the second city of the Byzantine Empire's European territories, and no emperor could simply ignore a threat to its walls. But the threat was neutralized before it could draw Basil away. The governor of Thessaloniki, Theophylactus Botaniates, was not merely an administrator, he was a military man and a close personal companion of Basil II, one of the emperor's most trusted friends, in a reign notable for how few close friends the emperor permitted himself. Botaniates met the Bulgarian diversionary force, defeated it, and then did something that transformed the situation at Kleidion. He marched north with his victorious army and joined Basil in front of the palisade, reinforcing the main Byzantine force at exactly the right moment. The Bulgarian diversionary gambit had failed. Basil's army was now stronger, not weaker, and the emperor's attention was entirely on the wall in front of him. Now, with the reinforcement of Botaniates' troops absorbed into the main force and Xiphias quietly separating from the camp with his detachment, Basil settled in to wait. The performance in front of the palisade had to continue. The Bulgarian garrison had to believe that the only threat was the army massed at the mouth of the pass. The frontal attacks had to keep coming, not with the same ferocity that might exhaust the Byzantine attackers unnecessarily, but with enough persistence to keep Bulgarian eyes and attention facing north. Every Bulgarian soldier, looking at the Byzantine army thundering against their wooden wall, was a soldier not looking over his shoulder. Xiphias's column moved. The accounts do not give us a precise itinerary, and the exact route through the Belasica heights has been debated by historians, but the general picture is clear. A column of picked infantry, men selected for endurance rather than raw numbers, moved through the dense forest of the Belasica slopes. They moved at night where possible. They moved in silence. The local guides led them along paths that wound through ravines and over ridgelines that no Byzantine military planner would ever have identified from a map. The soldiers carried their weapons and whatever supplies they needed on their own backs. There were no horses useful on those slopes, no wagons, no artillery, just men, iron, and the mountain. The climb through the Belasica forest in the July heat of the northern Aegean summer would have been punishing beyond easy description. Medieval infantrymen carried significant loads: weapons, shields, helmets, armor, water, food for at minimum several days. The forest on those slopes offered no cleared ground, no straight lines of march. Every step had to be tested, every formation compressed into single file along narrow tracks. Men stumbled on roots, slipped on loose rock, grabbed branches to pull themselves forward along gradients that made their lungs burn and their legs turn to stone. And they had to do all of it in silence, because noise carried in mountain forest, and a Bulgarian patrol that heard them before they reached the far side of the ridge would collapse the entire plan. We do not know exactly how long the crossing took. It was almost certainly measured in at least a day, possibly more, a grueling, relentless upward push through difficult terrain that tested the discipline and physical endurance of every man in that column. What we do know is that they made it. Xiphias and his detachment crossed the Belasica ridge, descended the southern slopes, and emerged behind the Bulgarian position at the Kleidion Pass without being detected. The element of surprise was intact. The trap was set. The date was July 29th, 1014. On that morning, Basil II launched his assault on the palisade from the valley floor. The Bulgarian garrison manned their wall as they had done repeatedly, confident in their fortifications, confident in the ground, watching the familiar spectacle of Byzantine forces moving against their defences. This was the attack they had been built to stop. They held their positions, they concentrated on the threat in front of them, and then, at the moment Xiphias had planned, the forest above and behind them erupted. The Byzantine detachment came charging down from the heights, screaming their war cries, crashing into the Bulgarian rear with all the kinetic force of men who had descended steep slopes at full speed into an enemy that had no idea they were coming. The psychological impact alone was catastrophic. An army defending a fortified position has its entire mental orientation pointed toward the known threat in front of it. The sudden appearance of an attacking force materializing from an impossible direction, from the mountains, from behind, from where no army was supposed to be, does not simply create tactical problems. It breaks the fundamental assumptions on which a fighting man's courage rests. It tells him, in the most immediate and visceral way possible, that everything he believed about his situation was wrong. The Bulgarian lines collapsed. Men who had been calmly defending a wall against a frontal assault suddenly found themselves in a panicked mass, pressed between Xiphias attacking from the rear and Basil's army driving forward from the front. The palisade that had stopped the Byzantine advance for days became irrelevant in minutes. Bulgarian soldiers broke from their positions, abandoned the wall, and ran. The disciplined defensive formation Samuel had constructed with such care disintegrated into chaos. The Byzantines poured through and around the shattered fortifications, driving the broken Bulgarian army before them. What followed was less a battle and more a pursuit. Byzantine cavalry, which had been useless against the wooden wall, but was devastatingly effective in open pursuit of fleeing infantry, ran down thousands of Bulgarians as they scattered across the valley. The numbers taken prisoner were enormous. Byzantine chronicles recorded figures of between 14,000 and 15,000 men captured, men who had nowhere to run, trapped between the mountains and a victorious army that was in no mood to let them escape. The killing and the capturing continued until the Bulgarian army, as a coherent military force, simply ceased to exist. Tsar Samuel escaped. He fled the disaster on horseback, barely ahead of the Byzantine cavalry, making for the castle at Strumitsa to the southeast. One account suggests that his son, Gavril Radomir, physically lifted him onto a horse and got him out of the collapsing camp in the final moments of the rout. Samuel was saved. But in the days that followed, even that partial consolation was stripped away. A Bulgarian rearguard force under the commander Ivatsa successfully ambushed Theophylactus Botaniates in a mountain gorge near Strumitsa, killing him and his men in a devastating reversal that reportedly shattered Basil personally. But strategically, the damage was already done. 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers sat in Byzantine captivity. The mountain wall was gone. The army that had defended the empire's heartland for the summer of 1014 was gone. And then Basil issued his order, the order that would break an army, break a czar, and begin the final collapse of an empire, the order that history would remember across 10 centuries, the order that would give him his name. The battle was over. The prisoners were counted. 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers, the captured remnants of the army that had manned Samuel's great palisade, sat under Byzantine guard in the valleys below the Belasica mountains. The war was not over, not technically, not yet. Samuel had escaped. His son, Gavril Radomir, lived. Other Bulgarian fortresses still held. Other Bulgarian armies could still, in theory, be raised. The empire had not yet been extinguished, but Basil II was not thinking in terms of the next battle. He was thinking about the next decade. He was thinking about what would happen when he turned his army south and marched home for the winter, and Samuel began rebuilding. He was thinking about the spring of 1015 and 1016, and every subsequent year he would have to come back to these mountains to fight the same war all over again. He had 15,000 prisoners on his hands, 15,000 fighting men who, if exchanged, ransomed, or simply released, would be back in Bulgarian ranks within a season. 15,000 reasons why this victory might not be final. He had to make it final, not just militarily, psychologically. He needed to send Bulgaria a message that could not be unread, could not be negotiated away, could not be answered with another palisade and another season's resistance. He needed to reach Samuel, wherever Samuel was hiding and recovering and already thinking about how to fight back. He needed to reach not just the Tsar's army, but the Tsar's will to continue. And so Basil issued his order. The order was methodical, it was systematic, it was cold in a way that distinguishes calculated cruelty from mere rage, because rage burns out, and what Basil ordered would take days to execute across thousands of men, requiring sustained organizational effort, a chain of command, and the continuous application of deliberate will. The prisoners were divided into groups of 100. In each group of 100 men, 99 would be blinded, both eyes completely, permanently. The 100th man would be blinded in one eye only, his remaining eyes spared so that he could function, so that he could walk, so that he could lead. 150 groups, 150 partially blinded guides. In each group, 99 men were made permanently, totally blind. The arithmetic of it was as methodical as anything in Byzantine military administration. The exact method used on such a scale in a field setting is not specified in the surviving sources. What matters historically is the scale and the message. Blinding as a punishment was not new in Byzantium. It was, in fact, deeply embedded in Byzantine legal and political practice, going back at least to the early 7th century. It had been used as a punishment for treachery, for rebellion, for political rivals who threatened the throne, a way of neutralizing an enemy without killing him, which had the particular advantage of appearing, at least superficially, less brutal than execution, while being arguably more complete in its destruction of a person's capability to function as a soldier, a general, or a ruler. Emperor Heraclius had used it. Constantine V had used it. The practice had a legal tradition and an institutional framework. What Basil was doing at Kleidion was not an improvised act of rage. It was the deliberate, scaled application of an existing imperial instrument of power applied to a number of men that had never been attempted before. The Byzantine military treatise known as On Skirmishing, composed in the mid-10th century, coldly recommended that military prisoners either be sent ahead under guard or, if they constituted too great a burden on the marching army, slaughtered outright. Basil chose neither of those options. He chose something that served a purpose none of those options could achieve, something that would cross the mountains on its own feet and deliver his message directly to the enemy's door. The blinding took time. We do not know exactly how many days the process required to complete across 15,000 men organized into their groups. What we know is that when it was done, Basil had the columns formed up and sent them north, back into Bulgarian territory, toward the court of Tsar Samuel. 15,000 men, 150 groups, each groping forward behind a single half-blinded guide, stumbling along the roads and tracks of the Bulgarian highlands. Most of these men had families, villages, names. They had eaten bread and slept in Bulgarian houses and prayed in Bulgarian churches. Now They were walking home, alive, breathing, unexecuted, but carrying with them a darkness that would never lift. There is a historical debate about the numbers recorded in our sources, and it deserves to be addressed honestly because this channel does not deal in mythology when history serves better. The primary account of the blinding comes from the Byzantine chronicler John Skylitzes, who was writing approximately 75 years after the events of 1014, around the year 1090. Skylitzes himself qualifies his account with a notable caution, using the Greek phrase os phasin, meaning as they say, when recording the figure of 15,000. He was indicating, even in his own time, that this was reported tradition rather than personally verified fact. A second Byzantine source, Kekaumenos, writing in the late 11th century in his work Consilia et Narration, echoes the figure of 15,000 without the same qualification. But this is still a late source drawing on the same era of oral tradition as Skylitzes. Modern historians have pointed out that Skylitzes had his own agenda. He was writing during a period of crisis in Byzantine history, civil wars, military contractions, Balkan losses, and he was explicitly trying to rally the aristocratic military class of his own generation by holding up the glorious victories of Basil II as a model to emulate. He wanted his readers to feel the weight of what their ancestors had accomplished and be inspired to match it. In that context, a figure of 15,000 blinded prisoners served a rhetorical purpose beyond mere record-keeping. It was a number designed to awe, to inspire, to remind Byzantium of what its armies were capable of when led by iron-willed emperors. None of this means the blinding did not happen. Basil's documented track record makes clear that this was entirely consistent with his approach to warfare and captives. Long before Kleidion, he had ordered the blinding of prisoners in earlier Bulgarian and Georgian campaigns. In northern Syria, he had ordered the amputation of the hands of Bedouin captives. Byzantine imperial practice had always treated exemplary brutality as a legitimate instrument of strategic communication, a way of making the mathematics of resistance look worse than the mathematics of submission. What Kleidion represented was the same instrument applied on an unprecedented scale. Whether the precise figure was 15,000 or somewhat less, the act itself is not seriously disputed by scholars. Something happened at Kleidion that crossed a threshold in the history of warfare, and its effects were real and immediate. Because the Byzantine tradition tells us what happened when those columns reached Tsar Samuel. Samuel was at his court. The accounts suggest he received word of the returning army's approach before he actually saw them, which means there was a moment of anticipation, a moment where he knew something was coming, but perhaps had not yet processed what it would look like. Then they came into view, column after column of his own men, stumbling forward on the roads of his own kingdom, led by their single-eyed guides, moving in that particular helpless shuffle of men who cannot see where their feet are falling. Thousands of them, then more thousands, then more. Men he had known, men who had held his palisade, men who had believed in the wall, coming home blind. The Byzantine chronicler John Skylitzes records what happened with stark simplicity. Samuel, when he saw them arriving in such numbers and in the state they were in, lacked the moral fortitude to endure the shock. Fainting and darkness came upon him, and he fell to the ground. He suffered a heart attack. 2 days later, on October 6, 1014, Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria was dead. He was buried at Prespa, on the island in the Great Lake that had been one of his capitals. The man who had built a Bulgarian empire that stretched from sea to sea, who had annihilated Byzantine armies in mountain passes, who had raided to the Peloponnese and defied Constantinople for nearly 4 decades, who had personally humiliated a young emperor in the bloodiest possible way in 986 and sent him fleeing on horseback. He died not from a sword, not from an arrow, not from the deliberate violence of an enemy. He died from the sight of what had been done to his own men, from the psychological weight of it, from the moment when the full meaning of his defeat arrived home on foot, in the dark. Basil had calculated everything correctly, not just the flanking maneuver through the mountains, not just the tactical coordination between Xiphias and the main army. He had calculated the emotional arithmetic of a Tsar, looking at 15,000 blinded men and understanding in an instant that the empire he had built was finished. He had turned Samuel's own soldiers into a weapon, a living message written in darkness and delivered without a word. After Samuel's death, the Bulgarian Empire did not survive him for long. Samuel's son, Gavril Radomir, succeeded him, but was murdered within a year by his cousin Ivan Vladislav, who took the Bulgarian throne in 1015. Ivan Vladislav continued the resistance against Byzantium with some vigor, winning notable victories, but the Bulgarian state was unraveling from within, torn between factions, exhausted by decades of war, progressively stripped of territory by Byzantine campaigns that continued year after year. Ivan Vladislav was killed during a siege of Dyrrhachium in 1018. His death left no credible heir with the will or the power to continue organized resistance. Within months, his wife Maria and the surviving Bulgarian aristocracy submitted to Basil II at Ohrid. The First Bulgarian Empire, the state that had existed in various forms since the 7th century, that had drunk from the skull of a Byzantine emperor, that had stood against Constantinople for generations and won, was formally absorbed into the Byzantine Empire in 1018. Basil marched in triumph through the Bulgarian lands. He was not vengeful in victory, at least not across the board. He was calculated, as always. He confirmed Bulgarian nobles in their local positions where they were useful. He preserved certain Bulgarian ecclesiastical privileges. He had always wanted the territory and its resources, not a wasteland of resentment that would require constant military occupation. The brutality of Kleidion had served its purpose. The subsequent peace required a different instrument, and Basil was capable of wielding both. He returned in triumph after the conquest and gave thanks at Athens, where the Parthenon then served as a church dedicated to the Mother of God. Contemporary accounts describe a man who accepted victory without the theatrical ceremony that other emperors craved. He was not performing triumph, he was recording it. He had set out to destroy the Bulgarian Empire, and he had done it. The epithet by which he would eventually be known, Bulgaroktonos, the Bulgar Slayer, became attached to his memory later, especially in 12th century tradition, long after his death. He never used it himself. He never needed to. The man who had ordered the blinding of 15,000 soldiers and watched their Tsar die of a broken heart did not require a nickname to explain what he was. History supplied one anyway. The Byzantine Empire that Basil II left behind in 1025, the year of his death, was the largest and most powerful it had been in 4 centuries. He had fought campaigns in Bulgaria, in Armenia, in Georgia, in Syria, in Italy, and across the Caucasus. He had expanded Byzantine territory from the Danube to the Euphrates. He had neutralized every internal threat, broken the power of the great military aristocracy, filled the imperial treasury so thoroughly that he left behind a surplus estimated by later chroniclers at 200,000 pounds of gold, a reserve so vast that his successors spent decades squandering it and could not exhaust it within a generation. He had done all of this without ever marrying, without producing an heir, and without, by most accounts, caring for any of the conventional pleasures that Byzantine court life offered. He was, in the most complete sense imaginable, entirely consumed by empire. And yet the story of Basil II is not simply the story of a great conqueror, it is the story of what total war does to a man and what a man shaped entirely by total war does to the world around him. Basil II was not born a monster. He was forged into one by civil wars and rebellions before he was 20, by the humiliation of the gates of Trajan when he was barely 30, by 50 years of grinding, ceaseless, brutal warfare in the mountains of the Balkans. He learned, somewhere in those decades, that the only language the conflict he had inherited would respond to was the language of absolute, unambiguous, unignorable force. Not just military force, psychological force, force that removed all doubt, all hope of revival, all rational argument for continued resistance. The blinding of 15,000 men was the most complete expression of that language he ever produced. It said, with a clarity that no treaty could match, "This is what fighting us costs. This is what the mathematics of resistance looks like. Do the calculation yourself." Samuel did the calculation, and it killed him. What followed in Bulgaria was, historically speaking, relatively quiet by the brutal standards of Byzantine-Bulgarian relations. Basil was not interested in exterminating the Bulgarians, he was interested in incorporating them, their land, their resources, their people, into a functioning imperial administration. He confirmed local Bulgarian nobles in positions of authority where they proved reliable. He preserved certain privileges of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, allowing it to retain its status as an autocephalous archbishopric centered at Ohrid, rather than being immediately subordinated to the Patriarchate of Constantinople. These were not acts of sentiment. They were acts of governance, the recognition that a conquered people who retain a meaningful stake in the new order are easier and cheaper to administer than a conquered people who have nothing left to lose. The man who ordered the blinding of 15,000 men understood with equal clarity when brutality had served its purpose and when administration needed to take over. But history does not permit clean endings. The Bulgarian Empire that Basil extinguished in 1018 rose again. The Second Bulgarian Empire, founded in 1185, threw off Byzantine rule and rebuilt itself from the same mountain heartland that Samuel had defended. The Balkans, as they have always done, remembered. The wounds that Basil's campaigns inflicted on the Bulgarian people did not close neatly into a satisfied imperial peace. They became the substrate of a national memory that persisted across centuries of Ottoman rule and which colors Bulgarian historiography to this day. A tradition that remembers Samuel not as the man who was defeated, but as the man who held and held and held until the sheer mechanical cruelty of his enemy finally broke what courage alone could not. Both perspectives are true. That is what makes this history. Basil II died in December of 1025, reportedly while in the middle of planning a military campaign to recover Sicily from the Arabs, still planning campaigns at the age of 67, still unable to stop. He was buried in the Church of St. John the Theologian at the Hebdomon Palace complex outside Constantinople. His epitaph, preserved in an anthology of Byzantine poetry, is one of the most striking self-assessments left by any medieval ruler. It remembers a lifetime of campaigning and asks the passerby for prayers. A strangely weary ending for a man who had spent his life at war. The man who had blinded 15,000 men to break an empire, who had turned grief and humiliation into 50 years of relentless campaigning, signed off not with a boast, but with a plea. The Byzantines gave him the name Porphyrogenitos, born in the purple. History gave him the name Bulgaroktonos, the Bulgar Slayer. Neither name fully captures what he was. He was the product of an empire that demanded everything from its rulers, and he gave everything he had. The price he paid was his humanity. The price Bulgaria paid was its independence. The price history pays every time it looks at the Battle of Kleidion is the uncomfortable recognition that the most effective acts of warfare are not always the ones that look the most heroic. Sometimes the most decisive weapon is a column of blinded men walking home in the dark. That is the brutal truth of the Battle of Kleidion, 1014 AD. One emperor, one order, thousands of men blinded in the dark, and an empire that died of what it saw. If this story hit you the way it hit me the first time I read it, drop a comment below. Tell me, was Basil II a military genius, or was he a war criminal? History has argued both sides for 1,000 years. I want to hear where you land. If you are new here and you made it all the way to the end, you already know this channel is different, so hit subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another episode. Share this video with someone who thinks they know medieval history. And if you want to go deeper, the next video is already waiting for you on screen. I will see you in the next war.